Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Film Score Podcast. Today, my guest is Patrick Stump. Now, you just might be familiar with Patrick as the vocalist and rhythm guitarist and composer for the band Fall Out Boy. But since 2017, Patrick has also started composing for film, TV, and other media, beginning with the animated film Gnome Alone, and most recently working on the Disney Junior animated show Spidey and His Amazing Friends, a SpiderMan show aimed for young children. It's actually, I believe, the first Marvel one of its kind, or at the very least the first Spider-Man show of its kind. It really surprised me. I never would have expected someone like Patrick to have his real passion in composing for film and TV, but it turns out that's what he wanted to do since he was, 5 years old, ever since seeing the original Tim Burton Batman film. So it's really cool to be able to see that dream come alive and see him almost starting over as an indie composer. And of course, you can find out more about Patrick on various social media or on his website, and you can hear some of his scores on various platforms, although a lot of them are still unreleased. And for those with little kids at home, the first season of Spidey and His Amazing Friends is out, and you'll hear us talk about, which apparently hasn't actually been officially announced, but I've gotten clearance from Disney, that the second season is underway. Now, of course, if you like the show, you like what you hear, follow along, leave a rating, review, all that stuff. But, most importantly, I hope you enjoy. Patrick, I'm so glad you could join me today. How have you been?
I'm good, man. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, you're a Chicago native, so that's where I'm based, so I had to have you on.
Yeah, happy to do it. It's trying to think of a lot of Chicago composers. It's a fairly limited, at least in film and TV. I don't know very many.
Yeah, I know a couple, but they tend to be on the smaller, more indie side, which is odd just because it's a big city, has such a big music scene.
Yeah.
But, maybe we just got to wait a little while before that side of the music scene really kicks off. I mean, obviously, that's kind of where you cut your teeth way back when, in the punk scene before blowing up with Fall Out Boy, and then I think in 2017 really making the move into scoring for film and TV as well. I don't want to kind of belabor the years before that because I'm sure you've talked about it quite a bit over the last 20 years, but how'd you make that jump? Where did that initial interest come from?
So that's what I always wanted to do. I'm a really weird guy for a band. It's always been strange. I mean, that's been the byline about us since we started, kind of, is like, yeah, it's this band and there's this singer and he doesn't seem to want to be a singer, he's just whatever. That was never my dream. It was not in a bad way. We got struck by lightning and it's incredible, but it's also like, I wasn't the kid that played around pretending to be a rock star and stuff. That wasn't my aspirations at all. I'm just a shyer guy anyway, but my first real musical thing, my first musical memory was definitely Batman, 1989's Batman, because you had the Prince soundtrack, which I loved, but the Danny Elfman score, which I really loved. It was a big deal for me. I remember being a little kid and sitting in my brother's room, and he had this Casio keyboard, and I remember that opening credits to Batman, where there's that logo, the Batman logo, and they go around and there's that great opening theme. But as it's building up, the bum 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 bum, and I would sit there and play it out. And I remember I must have been probably about 6 or 7 and playing that. And that was the first time that I could make music sound like music. I was just over the moon about it. And it really, and then I got obsessed with his scores, especially. Because then this is a silly thing, but I know back in the early 90s and late 80s, they used to reuse a lot of existing scores for trailers. So a new horror movie would come out and they'd reuse Psycho or something, and Beetlejuice was in everything. That score was in every trailer, and I remember picking that out and being like, oh, that's Beetlejuice, and I would go back and And I would sit there with my keyboard and the boot it, boot it, boot it, boot it, the left hand. That was like one of the first things that I played on a keyboard, after the Batman thing. And so I just really dove into that, and it kind of flowered out from there. Basically, I had Batman and Tim Burton movies, and my brother was really big into Star Wars, and that got me into John Williams. And so that was really pretty much my first musical anything. So long before I was playing guitar or anything, I was thinking about scoring. It was always something that I wanted to do, but forever I just thought it wasn't a thing that you could do. I didn't know that it was from the beginning of the band, I would always kind of throw it out there. If anybody was doing a movie, I'm like, hey, I score. And no one ever took it seriously and whatever.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, when the band first got out to Hollywood, because that happens, you go out to Hollywood and everyone wants to meet you, and they're all like, hey, we're going to put you in movies and this and that. And I'm like, I want to score them. And I remember after we did a record, Infinity on High, and I remember being really scared of how most bands just disappear usually. You don't really we had one hit and it was like, well, that's probably it, Yeah. So I was like, well, this is the last time I'm ever going to guarantee to have somebody pay for strings and horns, So I like put it everywhere. And I remember going to some meetings in Hollywood, and there were a couple parts on that record that were very self-consciously almost score. And I'd be like, hey, and I play that for them and because I didn't understand meetings at the time, but I was like, hey, this is what I really want to do, is this moment of music here where there's horns and strings. Can I do that? And they're like, yeah, we want you to write the theme song, But
what did it take for people for Hollywood and studios or directors, producers to take that side of you seriously and go, oh, you know what, this guy can do something other than write a rock-facing theme?
I had two big bluffs. I did two big bluffs in a row. One of them was the Hulk ride at Universal Studios. They had reached out about Fall Out Boy doing the music for the Hulk ride, and the band, we weren't really all on the same page about it. We didn't have the time and everything. So they came to me about it, and I was like, well, I'll do it if I can do orchestra, if I can do it an orchestral score. And they were like, it's not really what we wanted, but okay. And I was like, really? They wanted 2 minutes of music, and I was thinking about when I was a kid, and you go to the Six Flags, and the Batman ride there had, while you're waiting in line, they would play all of Danny Elfman's score, and I was like, can I write stuff to play in line? And they're like, sure, we're not paying you, we don't have more budget, but if you want to write that stuff and record it, that's fine. And so I went in and I did like 20 minutes of imaginary score for an imaginary Hulk movie that didn't exist, and it was the first thing I ever did. So now I look back on it and it's a little bit scruffy around the edges, but the fact that I did like a 70-piece orchestra or something crazy, it's a funny coincidence. I had been on this movie No Malone. Somehow I ended up doing a voice in the movie. I was doing a voicing a character, and I'm in the vocal booth, and one of the producers goes, I hear you score. I'm like, oh yeah, and she goes, do you want to score this movie? And I'm like, yes, I do. Because I had this 20 minutes of orchestra from the Hulk movie, or the Hulk ride, it was kind of like my reel. And they took a really big chance on me on No Malone. They were like, we'd like to maybe pair you with one of our composers that we usually use. And I'm like, no, I think I can do it myself. I had never done a movie. They said, well, do you know time code and stuff? And I'm like, sure. I had no idea. I didn't know what I was doing at all. But it pulled together and it was a blast. Basically, I hit the ground running from then, and I've been scoring ever since. And it's just my favorite thing I've ever gotten to do, musically, is getting to open up a new reel, and I get to look at it for the first time and spot it and know where I'm putting my cues and all that. It's spectacular. So
it's so funny. It reminds me, there's been this Johnny Greenwood interview snippet that's been floating around about when he first joined Radiohead as the keyboardist. He didn't know how to play keyboard, and he'd keep his keyboard turned off during rehearsals and just fake that for like 3 months, all while like moonlighting learning how to do it. And obviously it's like not exactly the same, but
no,
I mean, there is so much credence to like actually faking it till you make it.
That's actually one of the ways I learned. I'm not really a fluent reader in terms of score. I read them, but I don't. It's like I read my Spanish, where it's like I have to, I have to go back to it, and What's this line mean? But most of my reading I learned from BSing my way through marching band, through orchestra, because they put me on timpani, and I couldn't read at all. So I would just listen to whatever the tuba was doing. And anytime the tuba played, and you only have 4 notes, and anytime the tuba would play that note, I'd hit it. And it worked. They never called me on it for the entire time, but gradually I'd start to see, where I was on the score, and I'd learn and whatever. But it was kind of just throwing yourself into the fire and kind of going along with it. So it sounds like everybody does that.
Yeah. I mean, in doing that, what were some of the learning curves or the obstacles, or you looking back 4 or 5 years later and being like, oh, I can't believe I didn't do this, or I can't believe I did that?
In terms of orchestra stuff, one of the first things that I learned is how different live players are than synth. And that sounds like it goes without saying, it should be obvious. But if you're a writer now, it's a strange disadvantage and advantage, because you have a pretty natural sense of what an instrument's range is. When you're composing in Contact or something, most of the patches, the highest note on the violin is the highest note on a violin. Problem is, you don't have any relationship with this is comfortable for a player, So like, if you're going to be doing this run on this string, that's more comfortable for violas than it would be for violin or something, right? You don't know those things because you haven't spent, if you're coming from, I didn't come out of an orchestra or, conservatory or whatever. So I don't know those things. So that's kind of a big learning curve. And there's things that I would write differently. I'd especially orchestrate differently, where there are things that I notice the way I orchestrate has gotten a lot different in terms of like, this I would voice for horns instead of trombones, or this I would voice for, because you get more used to what a player can do, and that just comes from time. It's kind of like looking at yearbook photos when I hear some of my first scores where I'm like, oh gosh, why is that an oboe? That's like, just weird choices that you wouldn't make.
I mean, have you thought of revisiting some of those, like especially the Hulk ride where you have 20 minutes total of music? I mean, especially now, like hugely popular.
If they ever wanted me to, I do it again, because there's a lot of stuff there's a lot of weird choices that I made in that one, especially too because I was also trying to make 20 minutes in like a week. I had like no time, and I was kind of slapping it together, so it was a lot of random ideas. But yeah, if I could do it again, I would. That one I definitely would. But I don't know. I also kind of think on some level it just is what it is. It's like there's mixed things when I listen to No Malone where I'm like, I pushed for more brass in this spot, and I'd probably bring the brass down or whatever. Those kind of little things like that. But at the end of the day, it is what it is, and it's out there, and everything's not genius, And I kind of like letting mistakes exist too, because you learn, and sometimes that helps other people learn too. I like hearing. One of the things that really inspires me, it's a weird thing, but one of the things that really inspires me is when I hear another writer or composer do something that I don't like. They're building up to this chord, and then they go somewhere that doesn't feel like it resolves in the right way to me, and then I go in my head, I'm like, well, what if it did go here? And then before you know it, you've gone off in another direction. And so I like leaving those mistakes. Hopefully I inspire somebody else. Somebody else goes, Stump's okay, but he should have done this.
I was actually listening. So when I was growing up, like in middle school and high school, Fall Out Boy, that's when like you guys were getting massive. I always thought I was too cool to listen to that. I was a big metalhead, so I was like, oh, I can't listen to that stuff.
By the way, I would have been the guy that was too cool for Fall Out Boy if I weren't in Fall Out Boy. Like I know that about myself, so.
I mean, I do think it's so funny. There are certain bands that just like engender that. I have no idea why. And like looking back now, 15 years later, I'm like, oh, so stupid. But
yeah, but it's a thing. I think that's another part of music too. Another part of that like journey that you go on is I think everybody does that. I absolutely did that. I used to work at 2 record stores at the same time. I was working at the Sam Goody in the mall, the Sam Goody in Northbrook Court, and then I was working at Record Surplus. It was in Des Plaines. Record Surplus was a vinyl store, and so I was working at vinyl. I was very stuck up. I was very at the time I was really in on like the MC5 and the Stooges and that kind of stuff, and I was very snooty about Blonde Redhead and that kind of stuff. And so it was weird that I ended up in Fall Out Boy in the first place, but I think it's part of the journey that you need to go on anyway, to accept that like music serves different purposes. Music doesn't always have to be cool. And that's actually one of the things that's really challenging about scoring, is that sometimes you by nature need to do something you don't like. That is what the film calls for. That's what the scene calls for. So you have to like set aside your taste and think about what serves the character, you know, like this character really likes country. This is part of them, you know, like find a way or whatever, or there's or you're doing diegetic. Sometimes that happens where you openly have to write music that, you know, when you were 15 you were like, oh, this is the worst music ever, you know. And I've had to do a decent amount of like dance music for background stuff, and I remember being like a little punk kid being like, ooh, you know, dance music.
And I did have a very roundabout point of saying I listened to like some of the albums from them, like first time I'd ever heard them, and I listened to the first EP, and it is so interesting how it has that really rough, more DIY feel, and there is something really endearing about that, in whether it be in like punk, pop punk, or whether it be in, you know, in a score or anything. Mm-hmm. You eventually have the realization that no matter how long someone's been doing something, everyone's kind of learning on the job. And something 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, like, there are going to be mistakes that if you put them today back in that situation, it'd be done differently.
Well, and that's kind of one of the things that I think too, you know, to your question about, you know, if I could redo some scores, I'm like, well, probably not, because I would, for me, but then I think about me as like a fan of things. Like, it bummed me out so hard when Star Wars did the special editions and you can't get the old Star Wars anymore. The Star Wars that I had on VHS that I used to watch, I can't see that anymore. You know, I can, but I have to go into the special features and this and whatever. And it's like, that's frustrating, because that's what that movie is to me. That's the movie that I, you know, watched so many times that you quote in your head and stuff, and you know every shot and everything. So then to change that, it's not the thing that you grew up with. It's not the thing that you're attached to. I'm still new to this, but in the off chance that anybody is attached to any of my scores, I wouldn't want to change them, you know. And same thing goes with the band. You know, there are things like, I listen to some of our records and I'm like, it's that yearbook thing of like, why did I say it that way? Why did I sing that way? Why did I should have asked to turn down that guitar, whatever. But you're like, but somebody has a tattoo of it, so like, leave it alone. It's not yours anymore, you know.
So, you know, you saying, I don't know if anyone's attached to my scores yet, but moving from Fall Out Boy, from your solo stuff to composing, does that kind of feel like you're almost restarting, like creating a new identity for yourself?
Yeah, it's weird, because it's a really strange place, because first off, a lot of people in Hollywood see it as like kind of a backstep, which is really weird to me, because I'm like, it's so, to me, that was always the dream, right? But there are definitely people, and a lot of them don't make it for this reason, but a lot of guys go through, you know, their band, and then they have their hit, and then they're not on the charts anymore, and so they go into scoring. They try to go into scoring, and that really wasn't it for me. This is just what I always wanted to do. So, and like I said, you know, we were having meetings about, if you have your 15 minutes, people are like, oh, you're going to be the Beatles, you know, we're going to put you in, you know, Help, you're going to have your own movies and stuff or whatever. And any of that from the beginning, I'm like, I just want to score. That's all I want to do. I just want to score. That's the thing. But the fact that I'm in a band, and the fact that the band still kind of has some currency, I think it throws people off. It's weird. I can get called back for anything. I can call anybody and be like, hey, you know, I want to score. And they'll meet with me and talk with me because of the band. But there's this wall, because I think there is this expectation that it's like, but we're not really looking for the pop punk emo score. And I'm like, me neither. Why would you? It's not, none of my resume has that, you know, really. So, But I think it's weird. It's a kind of double-edged sword, because it gets me in the door, but then it also closes the door for me, you know, because it's a cool problem to have, but it's an interesting kind of place to be. And so, yeah, there is a little bit of, I guess, identity. It's weird, because it's the most honest I've been able to be. Back in the day when I would do a lot of radio interviews, you know, morning shows and rock and roll stuff, I am a studio nerd. I'm not a rock star. So to have to put that on and be like, you know, oh yeah, you know, they'd ask me dumb questions about celebrities and stuff. I'm like, I don't know any of these people. I don't care, not in a bad way, but that's not where my head's at. Right. And I'd love to talk about, you know, this microphone, you know, whatever. I'd love to talk about my effect chain on this, whatever, you know. So it's weird because now I'm in a place where I can finally expound for hours about the topic, but it's not as much what people want to hear, I guess, for me, I think it's, like I said, it's still a weird thing because I think there's still this expectation that you're going to be this rock star, When I tell people that I'm scoring, 90% of the time they're like kind of taken aback by if they know about scoring, they're kind of like, but that's a lot of work. I'm like, yes, I like doing the work. I enjoy, I enjoy it, but it's kind of this disbelief of like, really? It's, so.
But I do find it really interesting, though, that problem exists because I mentioned Johnny Greenwood earlier, but like you have Trent Reznor, Atticus Ross, Michael Levy started off doing all sorts of weird stuff.
Well, Mothersbaugh, Danny Elfman, Rabin, you're right.
Yeah.
I think the issue with me, more than say, certainly Trent Reznor or Greenwood, or to a lesser extent, Mark Mothersbaugh, and I guess Elfman too, is that my scores don't really sound like my music. My scores have an identity to themselves, but they don't really sound like the band all that much. There are moments for sure, but really the moments that they sound like are the more orchestral Fall Out Boy stuff. Those moments sound like my scores, but so I think that also throws people because, frankly, I'm not sure I would know how to do a Fall Out Boy score. I'm not sure I'd know how to do that. Our music was never really written to be atmospheric or part of a story. The story is the lyric. So I'm not sure I'd know how to make a lot of that music. As the closest thing I did was in Pacific Rim 2, I did a version of the theme, and it kind of sounds, that's kind of like what I would do. It kind of sounds Fall Out Boy-y to me, but it's still the score to a big action movie thing. So, but, and I should also say that Trent Reznor and Johnny Greenwood are people, I think, know them musically a lot better than they know me. I think I'm still kind of frankly, I think a lot of people are surprised that I play instruments. I think when you're in it, you're removed from what the reality of what people's perspective is. I mean, most people are like, yeah, you're the singer in some band, right? And it's like, yeah, but I mean, we're a weird band. I'm the guy that writes all this stuff, so.
My reaction wasn't that extreme, but like when I listened to Spell for the first time when it came out 3 years ago or so, like I said before, I wasn't a Fall Out Boy guy, so I was like, oh, who composed this? I like this. And I looked you up, and I was like, I didn't know he did this sort of thing. But like then you have to think back of, someone that's been in bands for 25 years, like chances are that they know how to make music. I saw people talking about being surprised that Dr. Dre during the halftime show could play piano.
I'm like, yeah, you're like,
guy's been like one of the most prolific producers for like 30 years. Of course he can.
I mean, even just by proxy, he's been sitting in studios with pianos for my entire life. He's probably at least played one once,
Yeah.
But yeah, it's funny. And I do think that's a funny reality that you learn pretty quick. And again, kind of back to that kind of snootiness that we all go through in high school or college or whatever, everybody has that moment, is that first off, I always think of the Rolling Stones when they went on tour. They took Prince on tour and they took Peter Tosh on tour. In both cases, people were really surprised and really angry and like, I don't like this and whatever. And there's this kind of expectation that the Rolling Stones only listen to music that sounds like the Rolling Stones. And you're like, why? Why would, if anything, that'd be like the last thing I would listen to. And I think it's pretty similar with most musicians. I've been surprised going around. We're a weird band too because we kind of straddle this line where we've gotten into a lot of different places. We've played hardcore festivals and we've played this, CMT awards, and we've played, we've been everywhere. Because of that, I've gotten to experience a lot of different musicians and musical experiences, and that's universal, is that musicians like music. A lot of fans like genres, but musicians like music, and across the board. And frankly, you'd be a kind of crappy musician if you didn't, because if you're only listening to the same thing, where would any genre be if you never, stepped out of your comfort zone?
To your point, it is very much like the listener versus musician dichotomy, because so many listeners and fans don't want that change. Like they just want that same sound that they've known for the first 3 albums to continue forever, whereas most of the time the musician's like, I don't want to make the same thing over and over.
And frankly too, it's not really what the audience wants anyway. They just say that, because that's another thing that I've watched over the years is people go through that experience of like, we're just gonna make one for the fans, and then the fans don't like that one because it's like, oh, it sounds exactly like and it's like, yeah, that's what that is. That's So you have to keep moving and keep trying new things. But that's one of the things that's so exciting about scoring is that I'm always forced to. And I think another thing that's been good for me is I'm in this strange place where a lot of people or a lot of productions are unsure of me because of the Fall Out Boy thing, because that's not what they want. So the ones that are willing to work with me tend to be a lot more risky, right? So not only are they hiring me, but they're also hiring me for something really out of my wheelhouse. Then I have to learn something really crazy, and it's really exciting. Like I did my second film was Seth Green did a film called Changeland, which is set in Thailand. So I had to acquaint myself with all of this South Thai music, specifically South Thai, because it's a completely different music tradition than Middle Thai or North Thai, whatever. So I had to learn all this music and also kind of filter it through the idea of this character who, had never been there before. I'm kind of combining all these things and whatever. And it sounds, it's really exciting to me to hear it when I listen back to it, because I'm like, it's kind of weird to me that I wrote that. I couldn't have written that if I didn't have the challenge of this story that I didn't think of. I would never have written that music, and it's really exciting. It's exciting to have those kind of opportunities, and it's happened a lot actually. Like I did a pitch. I didn't end up getting the movie, but it was so fun to do. I did a pitch, and the script was set in it was like a plane crashes in the far southern islands of the Philippines. So I'm going through all of this southern Filipino music, and it's like, it was just so exciting. And I bought these resonant gongs, Again, just having the excuse to learn all that stuff. If you never use it, it's still so exciting.
Right.
And then you're on a project, a few years later, and you're looking for a sound, and you're like, oh, I have that, So
does it ever become daunting because it's not like looking through your filmography or the shows that you've worked on. It's not like you're only scoring horror and like you've got comfort with that. Like you said, I mean, you're jumping all over the place. Gnome Alone is very different from like Black Friday.
Yeah. Well, it is. It's not necessarily daunting. It's a little bit. I think one of the things I've noticed about myself, and I wonder if every composer notices this about themselves, is you start to hear. So when I used to do impersonations when I was a kid, when I used to do silly voices and stuff, you realize pretty quickly that you have like 2 or 3 voices that you bend into different places, right? So, my Christopher Walken was basically my Doc Brown, but like just with a slightly different accent, And I feel like you start to notice that as a composer too, that everybody has a voice, Alan Silvestri is one of my favorite ones for this, because if you close your eyes and listen to Predator out of context, and then listen to Back to the Future out of context, and then listen to Who Framed Roger Rabbit out of context, and I'm not talking the themes, but like the small action sequences, whatever, those little moments, they happen in all of those scores. You'll even hear them in Avengers and stuff. And it's weird because I'm sure that when he's writing that, he's not thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to do the thing I did in this. It's that's how he speaks. And, John Williams does this. I mean, everybody does. Everybody has these little moments. And those are, I find I'm hearing myself, I hear those things now. I didn't notice it on my first couple movies, but now, you're like 11 or 12 in, and you start to go, oh, weird. It's weird. You listening back, I'm like, I did that in a horror movie in a completely different context, And so it's all at once it's kind of nice because you kind of start to know what your voice is, but then you also kind of worry. You're like, I hope, maybe I need to challenge myself more. Maybe I need to find something else here,
But I mean, a big part of it, I'm sure, is trusting what comes first, what comes naturally, and not trying to force something different solely for the sake of it being different.
Yes, of course. That's a great point too, is that, I mean, in Black Friday, there were points where I kind of leaned into more of the action and fun of it than the horror of it. And I was a little bit scared of, what the production would say. And I kind of voiced that, and they're like, nah, we hired you for that. We hired you because we know what you do. Like, they had heard the Banana Splits. I did the Banana Splits movie, which was a comedy horror. And they're like, we know what you do. We want you to keep doing it. We're happy with it. So yeah, there's a certain degree of like trusting yourself and trusting. And, a friend of mine once said too, that you're better off just doing you, because no matter what, you're going to be you, even if you're trying to be somebody else, even if you're trying to do, if you go into it being like, I'm going to write a Johnny Greenwood score, it's still going to be you doing it. It's interesting looking at the commonalities in that. Like I said, it's this weird kind of thing where you're like, this impersonation is still just off this impersonation, You have an instrument, you have a voice as a writer,
Yeah. And so I guess, going from that, we're building up to the present now, where you're scoring for the new Spider-Man animated series for kids. I'm sure as like a big comics fan, as a big superhero fan, like that's got to be really exciting to be able to work on that.
Yeah, it's insane. It's weird for me because Batman was my first love for film and scoring and everything, but I was always a Marvel guy. We just didn't have Marvel movies when I was a kid, so that was the superhero movie that we had. But I was a Spider-Man kid, I was an X-Men kid, so getting to do it, it's ridiculous, and it's and sometimes it's my first show, it's my first multi-season show, and there's a little bit of challenge to that because you don't get to savor it as much, you don't get to take your time as much. There's a schedule, so it's a little bit more locked than indie movies where half the time I turn my stuff in and they're like, oh, you know what, we're actually running behind, so whereas this I'm scrambling to the finish line every episode and whatever. So sometimes you have to stop and take a breath and be like, this is amazing. But it's still so cool to get to do. And there's a big challenge to it too, because I am such a comic fan. So I want to put all of the comic book in it. I want it to be, like in my head, I start seeing it and I get caught up in the action of it. And it's like, well, but it's for little kids, so dial it back. But yeah, it's incredible. And yeah, we're starting up another season, so now I've been doing it for long enough. It's crazy. It's awesome.
How does your process go, maybe right now, when you've got another season coming up? What's the ramp-up process, and then how are you working on an episode-by-episode basis?
Basically, I have every 2 weeks I have an episode, and I have to write or repurpose 22 minutes of music. And by now we have started repurposing. At the beginning I was like, we're not going to repurpose anything, I'm going to write everything, and it's like there is just not the time for that. And there also becomes the thematic reason not to do that. There are scenes that call on specific things, or your themes really calcify. So then, I know a vibe that I'm using for Doc Ock that I'm not necessarily rewriting, or not necessarily repurposing everything, but I know that generally what she sounds like when there's a lot of humor in the show, so I know what she sounds like when she's being funny. I know what she sounds like when she's in danger, when she's causing the danger, that kind of stuff. It kind of also writes itself after a while, because now you've done it for so long that you kind of watch the show and go, okay, well now here's Rhino and I know what his voice is. It's almost like a constant opera or something, where there's the leitmotifs of the characters and stuff, and they all start to interact. And even though it's a kid's show and it's not strict to that, it still kind of has that.
Well, I mean, that's something that I do appreciate, that you still have that intellect behind the music, even though it's a show for 5-year-olds, let's say.
Yeah.
Like, it's still not dumbing everything down because of it. Like, it's still treating the music, treating the show like it should be.
I have to say, I'm really impressed with Disney, with their focus on that. They push me, which I was surprised. For a kid's show, you kind of thought like, okay, well maybe, I thought maybe I'd be pushing, the art of it, but they really encourage you to go in that direction. And the spotting meetings are really fun. I really look forward to them, because the notes that sometimes you have these, I think every composer's had those spotting or note sessions where you're like, this person's asking for it to be slower, and this person's asking for it to be louder, and this person, and they're all these things that conflict, and you're like, I don't know, man, whatever. This is a lot more, it's really useful, and it's really exciting. So that's another layer of it that's really cool, and there are a lot of comic book people on the show too, so it's fun because we get excited and nerdy about it. So it's a blast. It's crazy to get to do. I would love to do superheroes for the rest of my life. It's the best.
I assume that it's like, there isn't continuity with all the movies and like
we're not in the MCU yet. Anyway, I don't know. Multiverse, who knows? But
yeah, right. Anything's possible now. But I mean, was there at all a push to use any of the thematic elements from those, or was it kind of an open book for you?
Well, it was kind of I kind of pitched it. I kind of pitched it in a way that I was like, I wanted to absorb all the stuff. The thing that I was thinking of is, if you're 4, this is the first time you're probably interacting with Spider-Man, right? And the Spidey universe, any of these characters. So I was like, I kind of wanted to give a primer to it, even though it's I mean, it's really, I have to say, it's really crazy working on this show and then going and seeing the new Spider-Man movie and being like, oh my gosh, our Green Goblin's a little different, you know? It's just a different tone, you know? I was thinking about combining all of these things. So when I composed my first themes and my first ideas for the show, I was taking sonic elements from the 60s show and from the Elfman score and trying to, and I even looked at some of the old Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends show and pulling all those things in, and then little moments where I was also kind of imagining, you know, what I would do, you know. So it's kind of a combination of a lot of things, because there are some that I was able to really, like I said, Spider-Man and the Spidey team, their themes really pull on a lot of things that are, it's not like I'm using any of that music, but they are inspired by existing music. Mm-hmm. Whereas somebody like Hulk, we have a like kind of funny little kid Hulk. It's not any Hulk we've ever seen before. So I had to make a new Hulk, which is funny because I did a different Hulk for the ride, you know. But it was a different process. So different characters get different processes. Whereas like Black Panther, I really wanted to evoke the score. It's not the same music at all, but I wanted to evoke that same meter, that same tama drum, that brass, you know. I really wanted to evoke that feeling because I feel like that score is just perfect. That's like one of my favorite scores, period, is the Black Panther score. So I was like, you know, when you get to a character like that, like, if it ain't broke.
Right. Well, and that's something that you can definitely hear when watching it, that there are times where the music feels familiar and other mm-hmm. times where it's like, okay, this is just carving its own path. And I mean, it's also nice hearing that there are more, in some of the underscoring elements, like, there are more just like pure rock aspects too, where like the guitar is driving the way.
Well, and that was the thing that you know, if anything, like I said, it's been kind of somebody asked me to do, you know, the Fall Out Boy score. I don't know how I do it. That was actually more challenging to me than the orchestral stuff, is figuring out the right level of rock in it, because it's not how I think. Frankly, there's not a lot of scores that I felt, you know, like when I was the scores that really grabbed me as a kid, it was Back to the Future and Star Wars and Batman and Ghostbusters. These are all strictly orchestral scores. There's a moment in Ghostbusters where there's like a rock element, but I mean, it's really short. It's not even on the soundtrack, actually, I don't think. But so it was actually kind of a challenge to me to figure out how to work that in. And now it's kind of fun. I kind of look forward to those parts, but that was probably, I'd say, of any of it, that was probably the hardest part of the show, was figuring out how to rock, I guess, you know, like how to rock and still have the superhero thing and the kid thing. I'm juggling a lot of things, you know.
I mean, that's got to be a hard balance, because you don't imagine like a crunchy guitar riff as something you'd play to a 4-year-old.
Yes, exactly. Well, and that was one of the things that was really funny too, was originally pitching the show, because they had given kind of some inspirations of what they were looking for. But I went in and kind of laid down some ideas, and it was funny because some of the people on the in the production were like, you know, this is perfect, you know, you dial it up, and then some of them were like, this is gonna play before breakfast, like maybe we find a, you know, so it took some time finding the right balance there, but I think it's exciting, and now it's a very comfortable place. Now it's like, especially getting into season 2. Now I sit down and I write it, and it's like those action sequences, I'm in a different place with it now, because now there's the backbeat that I wouldn't have thought of before. Now I play with that backbeat. It's weird. You almost go into this, like, just drum wise, you almost go into this like 70s Lala Schifrin score kind of thing, where there's the way that meter kind of goes through, you kind of find a way to do that with a rock band, you know.
And so I'm curious, with the couple tracks that you've released from it are like quite popular, and the show itself, I think Disney Junior has some of them on YouTube, and like some of them are like super popular, which really surprised me. Are you considering, you know, releasing an EP or an album of music at any point?
I have no idea. I mean, that's really up to the show and what they want to do. I'm just happy to be. If it were up to me, I would love to put out all of my scores. So whatever, but I'm just happy to be here. You know, if they want to put out the music, that'd be great. I'm also kind of I was kind of lightly complaining about how difficult it is to have people see past the name of the band and stuff or whatever. But I mean, it's ridiculous. I'm very lucky, and I know I'm really lucky that whatever we're going into season 2, that's a huge deal. I mean, a lot of shows don't get that, so I know how lucky I am. So I'm like, whatever. Everything else is caked. So
Hey, that's awesome. And honestly, I think that's the perfect note to end on.
awesome.
Very positive. Looking
Yeah.
forward to what's coming out next, and hopefully you do release some of the music, because I don't have kids, so it's a little weird for me to
Yeah, right.
to throw an episode on
Yeah.
to hear the music.
Bumping it in your car, yeah. Totally. All right, well,
But yeah, thanks again for joining me. I really do appreciate it.
yeah, thanks for having me.